Sycamore is a small, quiet town located in DeKalb County, Illinois. In 1950, it had a population of just under 6,000 residents and was generally considered a safe area. People didn't lock their doors because everybody knew everybody else. But that all changed in 1957 when a little girl went missing just outside her home. But first, I'd like to thank BetterHelp for sponsoring today's episode. Your mental health is not something to be taken lightly. Whether you've experienced something traumatic or it's something you're dealing with long term, we all need support sometimes, but it's not always the easiest thing to access. There are often long waits to even get to speak to a therapist, which isn't exactly ideal when you have a mental health crisis. BetterHelp is one of the world's largest therapy services, with over 25,000 licensed and experienced therapists who cover a wide range of issues. All you need to do to get started is answer a few questions about what you want from therapy, and BetterHelp will match you with the right therapist for you. If you find for any reason that your therapist isn't quite the right match, you can always switch to another free of charge. Once connected with your therapist, you can communicate with them however you want, whether that's by call, video, or message. You can message your therapist at any time and set up live sessions when it's most convenient for you. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/coldcasedetective. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com. It's also linked below in the description. And now let's dive in with today's mysteries. Maria Elizabeth Ridulph was born in Sycamore in March of 1950. The youngest of 4 children, Maria was a clever and well-behaved girl. She was an honor student in the 2nd grade and had previously received awards for her flawless Sunday school attendance. But according to her mother, Frances, Maria was also an anxious child who became hysterical if she got into trouble. She was also described as a screamer and was afraid of the dark. On the evening of December 3rd, 1957, Maria pleaded with her parents for permission to go outside. Snow was beginning to fall, and the 7-year-old wanted to play in it with her best friend, Kathy Sigmund, who lived on the same street. Maria's wish was granted when her parents allowed her to head outside after dinner. Out in the street, the friends played Duck the Cars, running to and fro between the elm tree on the corner of the street and the street pole, as they attempted to elude the headlights of oncoming vehicles. Then the pair were approached by a man. Kathy later described him as being tall and in his early 20s with a slender chin, light blonde slicked back hair, and a gap in his teeth. He also wore a colorful sweatshirt and had a light, thin voice. The man claimed he was 24 and that his name was Johnny and he was unmarried. He then asked the girls if they liked piggyback rides and dolls before giving Maria a piggyback ride. Afterwards, the 7-year-old ran into her house to get a doll to show the man. Kathy recalled that as they waited together, Johnny asked her if she'd like to go on a walk around the block or a trip in the car. She told him no, and he told her that she was pretty. Once Maria returned, Kathy ran back to her residence to get her mittens. She asked Maria to go with her, but her friend declined. When Kathy returned to the scene, Maria and the man were gone. Fortunately, Kathy wasted no time. She immediately went to Maria's parents and told them that the 7-year-old was gone. However, the family initially believed the little girl was just playing a prank, hiding somewhere nearby. It wouldn't have been the first time. Just a year ago, she had stayed a few blocks from home and had turned up just as her parents had organized a search party. Now, they sent Maria's 11-year-old brother out to find her. But he couldn't. Realizing that this wasn't a joke, Maria's parents contacted the police. Within an hour, the authorities, along with armed civilians, began searching the town, combing through the streets for any trace of Maria or the man who identified himself as Johnny. But all they found was Maria's doll by a neighbor's garage. The FBI presumed that the little girl had been taken over state lines and arrived in Sycamore a few days later to assist in the search. State police were also present at the time. Law enforcement interviewed numerous witnesses who had seen the two girls playing alone between 6 and 6:30 p.m. They also verified Kathy's story by speaking with family members who'd seen Maria come inside for her doll and Kathy for her mittens, and that Kathy had come to the door to report Maria missing. Using Kathy's timeline and the evidence of witnesses, they determined that Johnny approached the girls after 6:30 p.m. and that Maria was taken between 6:45 and 7. Once this was established, 8-year-old Kathy was placed in protective custody because she was the only person who'd seen Johnny, and therefore the only one who could identify him. Law enforcement was concerned that he may come back to harm her. As they continued to look for leads, investigators had Kathy leaf through photos of convicted felons and suspects who matched the description of Johnny, hoping that she would be able to pick him out from their list. A young man named John Tessier was included on the list based on a tip the police had received, but Kathy was never shown his photograph, and he was never included in a lineup. Tessier used the name Johnny, lived in the same neighborhood as the girls, and fitted the description of the perpetrator, although he was only 18 at the time of Maria's disappearance. Tessier was able to provide an alibi for the night in question, however. In late December of 1957, Kathy visited the Dane County Sheriff's Office in Madison, Wisconsin. Here, she was shown a lineup of potential suspects and asked if she recognized any of them. The 8-year-old successfully identified Thomas Joseph Rivard as Johnny. Rivard was a 35-year-old man with dark blonde, bushy hair. He was 5'4" and weighed 156 pounds. Notably, he had an alibi at the time of Maria's disappearance. He was in jail at the time, so subsequently, he was ruled out of the investigation. Years later, when Kathy was asked about Rivard and the 1957 lineup, she stated that she didn't remember picking him out. Maria's disappearance made headlines across the country. Authorities continued to investigate, searching for any clues that would lead them to the little girl. They interviewed suspects in the area, which included known sex offenders, as well as a man who was known to give children piggyback rides, but no evidence was discovered. Appeals for help from the police, as well as Maria's parents, proved fruitless. During the course of the investigation, police identified 2 suspects. One of these suspects was a Nebraska carnival worker and a former truck driver named William Henry Redmond, although the fact he was named in Maria's case is something which has been heavily criticized. In 1997, Sycamore Police Lieutenant Patrick Sola disclosed the 7-year-old's case, adamant that Redmond, who died 5 years prior, was likely the perpetrator in the case. Redmond was the suspect in 2 other cases of missing young girls. In 1988, he was charged with the murder of an 8-year-old girl in Pennsylvania who died in 1951, but the case was dismissed when a police officer declined to name his confidential informant. Redmond was also a suspect in the case of 10-year-old Beverly Potts, whose case we've already covered on this channel. Beverly vanished while heading home from the park one night in Cleveland, Ohio, in 1951. Lieutenant Sola believed Redmond matched the description of Johnny and claimed that he told a fellow inmate that he'd committed a crime similar to Maria's case. However, Lieutenant Sola has been heavily criticized for his theory. There is a lack of physical evidence tying Redmond to the crime, and Sola himself admitted that the available evidence was circumstantial. He suspected that if Redmond was still alive, it would be near impossible to convict him in Maria's case unless he confessed. He referred to the case as closed, but not solved, for this reason. The other main suspect in Maria's case is the aforementioned John Tessier. Born in Northern Ireland in 1939, Tessier moved with his mother and stepfather to Sycamore when he was 7 years old and became the eldest of 7 children. Tessier does not appear to have lived a troubled childhood. His biggest mistake was when he pushed a teacher and called her a name in the 10th grade, after which he was expelled from school. He was still living with his mother and stepfather at the time of Maria's disappearance, with the family residing 2 blocks from the Ridulph house. He was 18 years old and planning to join the US Air Force. On December 4th, 1957, the day after Maria disappeared, law enforcement officers visited the Tessier's home. This was a routine part of their investigation, where they searched the local neighborhood for any witnesses or clues. Here, Tessia's mother told detectives that her son had been at home on the night of December 3rd. His two half-sisters, Catherine and Jean, however, later testified that this was untrue. Not much was thought of Tessia initially, but he became a person of interest shortly afterwards when a local resident tipped off the police. Notably, FBI investigators were told a different story by the police. Tessia and his parents claimed that on December 3rd, the night that Maria vanished, he was in Rockford, Illinois, 40 miles away, where he was enlisting in the Air Force. He told them that on December 2nd and December 3rd, he had been in Chicago, undergoing physical examinations and visiting the recruiting station. This part of Tessia's story was corroborated by records. He stated that he spent the 3rd sightseeing in Chicago before traveling to Rockford, where he arrived at 6:45 p.m. He then called his parents for a lift back to Sycamore. Phone records at the time revealed that a collect call was placed from the Rockford post office to Tessia's home at 6:57 p.m., using the name John Tessia. Officers at the recruiting station in the area also confirmed that they spoke with Tessia at 7:15 p.m., as he had to drop off paperwork to them. Recruiters all recalled him differently. One called him nervous and suspected he was a drug addict. Another labeled him as a lost sheep. A third remembered there was a fresh cut on his lip and that he had said it was a good thing that he wasn't in Sycamore the previous night because of the disappearance of the girl. He also reportedly told a recruiter that he'd never be considered a suspect because his girlfriend's father was a deputy sheriff and that he'd shown this recruiter his little black book containing the names and addresses of Sycamore girls along with their bust and hip measurements. After telling his story, Tessia was issued a polygraph test which he passed. He was subsequently removed from the suspect list and no further investigation into Tessia was conducted. As mentioned previously, Kathy was never shown Tessia's photograph, and he was never included in a lineup, a blunder on the police's part, which was considered a massive failure later. Tessia left Sycamore after his polygraph test to report for basic training at Lackland Air Force Base. Months passed before Maria's parents' worst nightmare was realized when the skeletal remains of a child were discovered. On April 26, 1958, in Woodbine, an area about 100 miles from Sycamore, two mushroom pickers along US Route 20 stumbled across the badly decomposed body of a child. Wearing only a shirt, undershirt, and socks, the remains were under a partially fallen tree that had clearly been there for several months. Using dental records, a remaining lock of hair, and the available clothing, the body was identified as Maria's. The rest of her garments, including her coat, trousers, shoes, and underwear, have never been recovered. Notably, no photos of the scene showing Maria's body were taken, as the coroner feared they would be leaked to the public. As she'd been found within state lines, the FBI withdrew from the case. The initial autopsy in 1958 was unable to determine Maria's cause of death because of the state of decomposition. However, an examination carried out in 2011 showed that the 7-year-old had likely been stabbed to death. Specifically, she had been stabbed in the throat with a long, sharp blade, suffering at least 3 injuries to the area. It was also determined that other causes of death were a possibility, such as strangulation, as decomposition meant this method of killing could not be adequately investigated and ruled out. At some point in the next few years, the case ground to a halt. It was briefly closed by Lieutenant Sola in 1997, but reopened again in 2008 for a fresh examination when new information came to light. According to Tessia's sister, Janet, their mother said on her deathbed in January of 1994, "Those 2 little girls, and the one that disappeared, John did it, and you have to tell someone." As Janet understood this, her mother was telling her that Tessia was responsible for the disappearance and subsequent murder of Maria Ridulph. She was also made aware by one of her sisters that her mother had lied to investigators, claiming that Tessia was home on December 3rd, 1957. Another of Janet's sisters stated that she was in the room when Janet and Eileen, their mother, spoke, but she testified that she only heard Eileen say, "He did it." Still, she testified that she had the same understanding of what her mother meant, and admitted that she had suspected for years that Tessia had been involved in the case. After Tessier was dismissed from the investigation back in 1957, his life had not improved. He spent 13 years in the military before leaving and moving to Seattle, Washington. In 1974, he graduated from the police academy and later became an officer in Milton, Washington. Here, he clashed with the police chief and was almost fired as a result. The police chief had a list of complaints about Tessier's work and conduct, noting the way he often started relationships with victims of crimes who contacted the police for help. One of the women he bonded with was going through a divorce, resulting in Tessier having many run-ins with her ex-husband. Another of his partners was a sex worker, and in a separate incident, he took a topless photo of a 17-year-old girl in a Playboy-type pose. The police chief added that Tessier was not very well liked, and several complaints were lodged against him regarding his conduct from other departments. Tessier married 3 times. The first relationship produced 2 children, a boy and a girl. Each union eventually broke down. Horrifically, Tessier's third ex-wife later told investigators that she once found a nude picture of his own 12-year-old daughter, and later learned that while she was at work, he would take suggestive photos of the girl and her friends. Christine Marie Tessier went missing as an adult, aged 34 in 2005. She was found a month later, but her remains were not identified until 2013. Then in 1982, he took in a runaway teenager in Tacoma, Washington, 15-year-old Michelle Weinman, along with her friend. Michelle came to meet Tessier through her friend, who knew he was a police officer. Tessier, now 42, taught Michelle how to drive, how to apply makeup, and how to dress, both in a way that he preferred. He took her out on trips and made sure she stayed in school. Michelle recalls, "I was raised to fear God, trust police officers, and respect teachers." Eventually, though, Tessier became even more disturbing. Michelle later testified that Tessier fondled her and performed oral sex on her one night. Tessier was charged with statutory rape, but negotiated with the prosecution and eventually pled guilty to communication with a minor for immoral purposes, taking his charge down from a felony to a misdemeanor. He was given 1 year of formal probation and resigned from the Milton Police Department. When Maria's case was reopened in 2008, it came to light that Tessier, now going by the name of Jack McCullough, had once threatened to kill Janet with a gun and had sexually molested one of his half-sisters, Jean, when she was a child. Jean also alleged that he had molested other neighborhood girls in bushes and in a stairwell at the local elementary school, that he had sexually assaulted her, and he had offered her to his military friends once when he was on leave. She was just 14 at the time. As Tessier was estranged from the family at the time of his mother's death in 1994, he never attended the funeral, but legally changed his name that year, stating that he wished to honor Eileen by taking her maiden name. According to Janet, she spent 14 years trying to get the attention of law enforcement in regard to her mother's deathbed statement. She pleaded for them to listen and investigate her half-brother, but was often disregarded. Lieutenant Sola from the Sycamore police claimed that Janet had never spoken to him, but added that he would not have suspected Tessier of being involved because his stepfather, Ralph, had painted the Sycamore police cars, and most people in the force were on good terms with Ralph. Furthermore, Tessier had been cleared by the FBI back in 1957. It wasn't until 2008 that the Illinois State Police listened and had their cold case unit look into Tessier's involvement. After hearing statements from Tessier's sisters, authorities also heard from a woman who alleged that as a child, Tessier had given her a piggyback ride, but refused to put her down afterwards until her father intervened. Investigators reviewed evidence which threw the original timeline into question, and so they created a fresh one, under which Tessier could have taken Maria and driven to Rockford in time to make the 6:57 p.m. telephone call before he met with recruiting officers at 7:15. If this was what truly happened, though, it would mean that Maria was taken at around 6:20 and no later. With this new timeline under their belts, investigators turned to Kathy Sigmund, now named Kathy Chapman. They hoped to show her a photographic lineup that would include Tessier's picture, but as he'd been expelled in the 10th grade, he was not featured in the school's yearbook, so investigators took a newer photograph instead. Kathy identified Tessier as Johnny, The photo of Tessia had been given to the police by an ex-girlfriend, who also provided them with an unused, military-issued train ticket. It was dated December 1957 and was from Rockford to Chicago. To detectives, this suggested that Tessia had been on the train to Chicago and that he had taken his car instead. This meant he could have driven back home to Sycamore on the 3rd before heading to Rockford. A high school friend of Tessia's claimed that he saw his recognizable vehicle, a Pontiac with flames painted on the sides, in Sycamore that afternoon, but couldn't see who was behind the wheel, although he mentioned that Tessia didn't allow others to drive his car. In July of 2011, the Illinois State Police joined up with the Seattle PD and brought Tessia in for questioning. A professional interrogator was used due to Tessia's law enforcement training and experience. While the now 72-year-old seemed calm and collected, he became irritated, hostile, and evasive when he was given questions about Maria. At one point, he refused to answer further, and he was subsequently arrested for the kidnapping and murder of Maria Ridulph and extradited to Illinois. That same month, Maria's body was exhumed and checked for DNA evidence, but none was found. It was during this examination of the remains that the 7-year-old's likely cause of death was determined. Reportedly, the DeKalb County State's attorney was reluctant to take the case on. It was 50 years old and had very little physical evidence, but he was encouraged by both Maria's and Tessia's families, both of whom believed he was guilty. On the back of this persuasion, he formally charged Tessia. The trial began in September of 2012, and the prosecution argued that Tessia was attracted to Maria and decided to snatch her from the street, but ended up killing her. The reports, stating that Maria had likely died from being stabbed multiple times, were presented in court. It was suspected but never proven that Tessia molested Maria, so it was never brought up during the trial. The prosecution had little physical evidence, but a lot of witnesses, including Maria's family, neighbors, and law enforcement, as well as Kathy, who identified Johnny as Tessia while in court. Another friend of the two girls testified that he had offered her a piggyback ride too, at a different time. 3 of Tessia's inmates testified that he discussed the case and admitted to being involved, but their stories were inconsistent and didn't match the evidence that Maria was stabbed. On the advice of his lawyers, Tessia never took the stand in his own defense. His team, however, argued that the prosecutors had been pressured into charging him by the two families, and that there was no evidence tying him to the crime, nor was there any motive or even an indication that he was in the area at the time of Maria's disappearance. Then, on September 14th, 2012, Tessia was convicted of the kidnapping and murder of Maria Ridulph. He was given a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 20 years. However, Tessia appealed his convictions. On February 13, 2015, the Illinois Appellate Court upheld the murder conviction but not the kidnapping, as, at the time, the charge had a 3-year statute of limitations in effect. They added that Eileen's deathbed testimony should not have been used as evidence, but decided not to overturn the murder conviction. Later that year, Tessia asked for his murder conviction to be set aside. By this time, the DeKalb County State's attorney had changed, with Richard Schmack taking over from Clay Campbell. Schmack noted that evidence had been kept out of the trial, which backed up Tessia's initial alibi, including phone records which placed him in Rockford, not Sycamore, as had been alleged during the trial. Ultimately, Schmack deemed that Tessia could not have been present in Sycamore at the time of the disappearance, and a court hearing took place in the spring of 2016. A month later, a new trial was ordered, but a week passed, and the judge decided to dismiss the charges altogether, although Tessia could be tried again in the future. Tessia was declared innocent on April 12, 2017, by the DeKalb County Circuit Court. That same year, an anonymous letter found its way to Illinois police, stating the name of a new potential suspect. However, nothing further has come from this lead so far. Maria's case is still unsolved. And there you have the facts. Please leave a comment down below with your own theories and speculations, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.